Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for 20 years, and in that time he had perfected the art of being Steve Harvey the entertainer. He could crack jokes in any situation, make funny faces at ridiculous answers, keep the energy high and the audience laughing. His professional persona was one of humor, charisma, and unshakable composure. But on that crisp November afternoon in 2024, a 24-year-old woman named Sarah Mitchell was about to say something that would completely shatter Steve's carefully maintained character, strip away all the humor and entertainment, and reduce him to raw, unfiltered emotion in a way that viewers had never seen before. What Sarah revealed about her father would break Steve's heart and remind millions of viewers what true heroism looks like in its quietest, most selfless form. Before we dive into Sarah's extraordinary story, if you believe in honoring the heroes who sacrifice in silence, the fathers who carry unbearable burdens with grace, and the children who finally speak the truths their parents are too humble to share, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. What you're about to hear will change how you think about strength, sacrifice, and what it really means to be a hero. The Mitchell family from Charlotte, North Carolina stood ready to compete against the Rodriguez family from Atlanta, Georgia. The Mitchell family consisted of 5 members, and something about them immediately caught Steve's attention. Standing in the center position was Thomas Mitchell, a 50-year-old man who moved with a slight limp and carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed almost military in bearing. He was of average height, with graying hair cut short and eyes that held both kindness and a shadow of something else, something harder to name. Beside Thomas stood his wife Rachel, 48, a warm-looking woman with gentle eyes who kept a protective hand on her husband's arm. Next to Rachel was their daughter Sarah, 24, a poised young woman with her father's serious eyes and her mother's warm smile. The 4th family member was Thomas's younger brother, 45-year-old Mark, who stood protectively close to Thomas. And the 5th member was Sarah's fiancé, 26-year-old Daniel, who had been welcomed into the family fold and was clearly devoted to Sarah and her family. During introductions, Steve Harvey worked his way down the line with his characteristic energy and humor. When he got to Thomas, he extended his hand for a handshake, but noticed immediately that Thomas's handshake was different. His right hand gripped firmly enough, but there was something off about the movement, a stiffness or limitation that Steve's observant eye caught. "Thomas Mitchell from Charlotte," Steve said warmly. "Good to have you here. What do you do for a living, Thomas?" Thomas's voice was quiet but clear, with a slight southern accent. "I'm retired now, Mr. Harvey. I used to be in the military, served for 22 years. Now I just try to keep busy, do some volunteer work, spend time with my family." Steve's expression shifted to one of immediate respect. 22 years in the military. Thank you for your service, sir. What branch? Thomas stood a little straighter. Army, Mr. Harvey. Infantry. Did 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. The audience erupted in applause, and Steve nodded with genuine admiration. "That's incredible service to our country. Your family must be very proud of you." Sarah, standing next to her mother, spoke up before Thomas could respond. "We are incredibly proud, Mr. Harvey. My dad is the bravest, strongest, most selfless man I've ever known." There was something in her voice, an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the casual nature of the introduction, that made Steve look at her more closely. He saw tears already forming in her eyes, saw her mother squeeze her shoulder gently as if steadying her, saw Thomas look uncomfortable with the praise, his jaw tightening slightly. Steve, with his years of experience reading people and sensing when there were deeper stories beneath the surface, felt something shift in the atmosphere. But he moved on with the introductions, meeting Rachel, Mark, and Daniel, getting the family settled and ready to play. The game began, and the Mitchell family played with impressive coordination and teamwork. Thomas was a solid player, giving thoughtful answers and encouraging his family members. Sarah was sharp and quick, frequently getting top answers on the board. Rachel provided steady support. Mark added competitive energy, and Daniel proved he had earned his place in the family by playing with enthusiasm and good instincts. The Mitchell family built an early lead over the Rodriguez family, who were gracious competitors clearly enjoying the game despite being behind. As the game progressed through the first few rounds, Steve noticed something about Thomas. The man never sought the spotlight. always deferred to other family members to give answers when they had a choice, and seemed almost uncomfortable with attention or praise. When he got a number one answer, he simply nodded and stepped back, letting his family celebrate while he remained quiet and reserved. It was the behavior of someone who was deeply humble, or perhaps someone who didn't feel he deserved recognition, and it intrigued Steve. The turning point came in the fourth round, when the Mitchell family had control of the board and needed just one more answer to win the round and secure their overall victory. The question seemed straightforward enough, typical Family Feud material. Name a reason why a man deserves to win an award. The family had already revealed four answers: hard work, bravery, helping others, and overcoming obstacles. They had no strikes and needed to find just one of the remaining answers. It was Sarah's turn to answer, and she stepped up to the podium with a determined expression that suggested she had been waiting for this moment. Steve positioned himself next to Sarah with his microphone. "All right, Sarah, your family is doing great. Just need one more answer and you've got this round locked up. Name a reason why a man deserves to win an award. What do you think?" Sarah looked at Steve, then looked at her father standing with the rest of the family, and something in her expression shifted. The game show contestant disappeared, replaced by a daughter who had clearly been carrying something heavy and had finally found the moment to release it. "Mr. Harvey," Sarah said, her voice already trembling with emotion, "I need to answer this question not about a hypothetical man, but about my dad. Because my dad deserves to win an award, deserves recognition, deserves to be honored, and he would never, ever tell you why. But I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell everyone." Steve's professional smile faltered slightly. He glanced at Thomas, who had gone very still, his face showing alarm and something close to panic. Rachel had her hand over her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. Mark looked like he was bracing for impact. Daniel moved closer to the family, sensing the weight of what was about to happen. "Sarah," Steve said gently, "what are you talking about?" Sarah took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her words came out in a rush of emotion that had clearly been building for years. "My dad doesn't just deserve an award for being brave in combat, though he was. He doesn't just deserve an award for serving his country for 22 years, though he did that honorably. My dad deserves an award for what he's been living with for the last 8 years and what he's never complained about, never asked for sympathy for, never used as an excuse for anything. My dad deserves an award for being the strongest person I have ever known, even though his body is broken and in constant pain." The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey stood frozen, his microphone slowly lowering, as he sensed this was about to become something far bigger than a game show answer. Thomas had closed his eyes, his jaw clenched, looking like a man who had just had his deepest privacy violated, even as he knew his daughter was speaking from love. Sarah continued, tears flowing freely now, but her voice growing stronger, more determined. 8 years ago, my dad was on his final deployment in Afghanistan. He was a squad leader, responsible for 12 younger soldiers. They were on a patrol in Helmand province when their convoy was hit by an IED, an improvised explosive device. The blast destroyed the lead vehicle and injured several soldiers. My dad was in the second vehicle, and he could have stayed there, could have waited for backup, could have kept himself safe, but he didn't. He ran toward the burning vehicle to help his men. Sarah's voice broke completely, and she had to pause to collect herself. Rachel had moved to stand beside her daughter, supporting her, while Thomas remained rooted in place, his eyes still closed, his whole body radiating tension and pain. "The second explosion happened while my dad was pulling one of his soldiers out of the wreckage," Sarah continued. "It threw him 15 feet through the air. The blast wave caused traumatic brain injury. Shrapnel tore through his legs, his back, his right arm. His spine was damaged. He was clinically dead for 2 minutes before the medics revived him. They didn't think he would survive the helicopter ride to the field hospital. They didn't think he would survive surgery. They told my mom to prepare to say goodbye, that even if he lived, he would probably never walk again, never have any quality of life." The audience was crying now, hands over mouths in shock and grief. Steve Harvey stood completely still, and for the first time in 20 years of hosting, his professional persona had completely disappeared. He wasn't Steve Harvey the entertainer anymore. He was just a man listening to a story of heroism and suffering, and tears were streaming down his face. But my dad survived, Sarah said, her voice filled with pride and pain in equal measure. He survived surgery after surgery. 17 surgeries in total over the next 2 years. He survived infections that should have killed him. He survived the doctors telling him he would never walk, and he proved them wrong by learning to walk again through sheer force of will and months of agonizing physical therapy. He survived having his entire life torn apart, his military career ended, his body broken, his future uncertain. Sarah wiped her eyes but kept talking, needing to finish, needing people to understand. And here's what makes my dad a hero, Mr. Harvey. Not the saving his men, though that was heroic. Not the surviving, though that took incredible strength. What makes my dad a hero is what he's done every single day for the last 8 years. He lives in constant pain, constant. The nerve damage in his legs and back means he hurts every moment of every day. He takes pain medication that barely touches it. He can't sleep through the night because the pain wakes him up. He has PTSD from the explosion and from war in general. He has nightmares. He has flashbacks. He has panic attacks that leave him shaking and unable to breathe. Sarah looked directly at her father, who was now openly crying, his defenses completely shattered. And despite all of that, my dad has never complained, not once. He gets up every morning even though his body is screaming at him to stay in bed. He volunteers at the VA hospital helping other wounded veterans, even though being there triggers his own trauma. He coaches youth baseball even though standing for 3 hours makes his back hurt so badly he can barely walk afterward. He showed up to every single one of my college events, drove 6 hours each way multiple times, even though sitting in a car for that long causes him agony. He walked me down the aisle at my engagement party last month, even though I know every step hurt because he didn't want me to remember that moment with him in a wheelchair. The tears were streaming down Sarah's face, but she wasn't finished. My dad saved 3 soldiers that day in Afghanistan. All 3 of them survived because of him. One of them, a 22-year-old kid named James, he would have burned to death in that vehicle if my dad hadn't pulled him out. James is alive today, married with a baby daughter, because my dad risked his life and destroyed his body to save him. And my dad has never asked for recognition for that. Never talked about it unless directly asked. Never used his injuries to get sympathy or special treatment. He just quietly lives with the consequences of his heroism and tries to make the world better every single day despite his pain. Steve Harvey stood there, and something broke inside him. The professional host, the comedian, the entertainer, all of it dissolved completely. He was crying without restraint, his shoulders shaking, making no attempt to hide or control his emotion. He looked at Thomas Mitchell, this quiet, humble man who had been standing there the whole game just trying to support his family, and Steve saw him completely differently now. He saw the pain Thomas carried in his body, the weight of trauma he carried in his mind, the grace with which he carried both without complaint or demand for recognition. Steve walked over to Thomas, and for a long moment, the 2 men just looked at each other. Then Steve did something he had never done in 20 years of hosting Family Feud. He set down his microphone, took off his suit jacket, and wrapped it around Thomas's shoulders like a medal or a cloak of honor. Then he pulled Thomas into a tight embrace, holding him while the studio audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. "You are a hero," Steve said directly into Thomas's ear, his voice breaking with emotion. "You are a goddamn hero, and I am honored to be in your presence." Thomas finally broke, the carefully maintained composure crumbling completely. He sobbed into Steve's shoulder, this 50-year-old man who had carried so much for so long, finally allowing himself to be vulnerable, to be seen, to be honored. The Family Feud stage became a sacred space, witnessing not a game show moment, but a moment of profound human recognition and healing. Steve and Thomas held each other for what felt like an eternity. 2 men from completely different worlds connected by the simple acknowledgement of suffering and sacrifice. When they finally separated, Steve retrieved his microphone, wiping his eyes roughly with his hand. He turned to address the cameras, but it took him several attempts to speak because his voice kept breaking with emotion. "I need to tell you something," Steve finally managed to say, addressing the viewing audience directly. "I've been doing this show for 20 years. 20 years of meeting families, hearing stories, trying to entertain people and make them laugh. And I'm good at my job. I know how to keep things light and fun. But every once in a while, something happens that reminds me that television can be more than entertainment, that this platform can be used to honor people who deserve honor, to tell stories that need to be told, to shine a light on quiet heroes who would never seek that light for themselves. He gestured to Thomas. Thomas Mitchell is a hero, not because I'm calling him one, but because that's simply the factual truth. He saved lives at the cost of his own body and his own peace of mind. And then he came home and lived with the consequences of that heroism with more grace and strength than most of us will ever have to demonstrate. His daughter Sarah just told us a truth that Thomas would never tell himself, because true heroes don't seek recognition. They just do what needs to be done and then live with the cost without complaint. Steve turned to Sarah. And you, young lady, you did something incredibly brave just now. You honored your father in the way he deserves to be honored. You made sure his sacrifice was seen and acknowledged. That took courage, and I'm proud of you. He looked at the production team offstage. We need to stop taping. This is bigger than the game. We need to take a break. The audience remained standing, still applauding, many of them crying. The Rodriguez family had moved to stand with the Mitchells, all of them crying together. The competition completely forgotten in the face of something more important. During the extended break, Steve sat with the Mitchell family in a private area backstage. Thomas had composed himself somewhat, though his eyes were still red and his hands still shook slightly. Steve wanted to hear the fuller story, to understand everything that Thomas and his family had been through. Thomas, with prompting from Sarah and Rachel, told the detailed version of that day in Afghanistan. He described the routine patrol that turned into a nightmare in an instant. He described the sound of the explosion, like the world ending, and the immediate chaos and confusion that followed. He described seeing the burning vehicle and knowing that his men were inside, knowing that he had to get them out, not even thinking about the danger to himself. I was their squad leader, Thomas said quietly. They were my responsibility. Some of them were just kids, 19, 20 years old. I couldn't leave them. I didn't even think about it. I just ran. He described pulling Private James Hendricks out of the vehicle, the young man's uniform on fire, his screams of pain and terror. Thomas had put out the flames with his bare hands, not even noticing he was burning himself. He had started dragging James away from the vehicle when the second explosion occurred. I don't remember much after that, Thomas said. I remember flying through the air. I remember hitting the ground so hard I couldn't breathe. I remember thinking about my family, about Sarah and Rachel, and being so angry that I might not see them again. Then everything went black. He described waking up weeks later in a military hospital in Germany in more pain than he had ever imagined possible. His legs were wrapped in bandages. His back was broken. His arm was shattered. He couldn't move without screaming. The doctors told him bluntly that he would never return to active duty, that he might never walk normally again, that his life as he knew it was over. The physical pain was terrible, Thomas said, his voice distant as if he was back in that hospital room, but the mental pain was worse. I felt like I had lost everything that defined me. I was a soldier. That's who I was, what I did, how I understood myself. And suddenly, I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was just a broken man in a hospital bed, completely dependent on others for everything, unable to even go to the bathroom by myself. Rachel spoke up, describing those early months from her perspective. She had flown to Germany to be with Thomas, bringing Sarah, who was 16 at the time. They had spent months living in temporary housing near the hospital, visiting Thomas every day, watching him struggle through surgeries and setbacks and small victories. There were days he wanted to give up, Rachel said, crying. Days when the pain was so bad he would beg the doctors to just let him die. Days when he couldn't see any future worth living for. But he kept fighting, partly for himself, but mostly for us. He told me once that the only thing that kept him going was the thought of walking Sarah down the aisle someday, of being there for the important moments in her life. That dream kept him alive when everything else felt hopeless. Sarah described watching her father go through the grueling physical therapy, the agonizing process of learning to walk again when his body didn't want to cooperate. She described seeing him fall dozens of times, seeing him cry from frustration and pain, but also seeing him get back up every single time and try again. He never gave up, Sarah said. No matter how hard it was, no matter how much it hurt, he kept trying. He kept fighting. And eventually, he could take a few steps with a walker, then a few more with a cane. Then finally, he could walk on his own, even though it hurt him and even though he limped. He did it because he promised me he would, and my dad always keeps his promises. Thomas's brother Mark added his perspective, talking about how Thomas had come home from the war a changed man in so many ways. The physical injuries were visible, but the psychological wounds were harder to see and in some ways harder to treat. Thomas had nightmares that woke the whole house. He had panic attacks triggered by loud noises or crowded spaces. He withdrew into himself, struggling with depression and survivor's guilt. He felt guilty that he survived when other soldiers didn't, Mark explained. He felt guilty that his injuries had affected his family, that Rachel had to become a caregiver, that Sarah had to see her father broken and in pain. He carried so much guilt on top of the physical pain, and for a long time, I didn't think he would survive it. Not physically, but mentally and emotionally. I thought the war might kill him even though he had made it home. But Thomas had survived that too, largely through therapy at the VA, through support groups with other wounded veterans, through the love of his family, and through sheer determination to not let his injuries define him or destroy him. He had slowly built a new identity that wasn't soldier, but was veteran, father, husband, volunteer, coach, mentor. He had found new purpose in helping other wounded veterans navigate the challenges he had faced, in being present for his family, and contributing to his community in whatever ways he could. "I'm not going to lie to you, Mr. Harvey," Thomas said, looking Steve directly in the eyes. "Some days are really hard. Some days the pain is so bad I can barely function. Some days the PTSD is overwhelming and I can't leave my house. Some days I look at myself in the mirror and I see a broken man who can't do the things he used to do, who can't protect his family the way he wants to, who is a burden instead of a provider. Those are dark days, and I've had a lot of them." He paused, collecting himself. "But I have more good days than bad days now. I have a wife who loves me despite everything. I have a daughter who is proud of me, though I don't always understand why. I have a purpose in helping other veterans. I have my faith, my family, my community, and I have the knowledge that the 3 men I pulled out of that vehicle are alive and living their lives because of what I did. James Hendricks, the kid I pulled out first, he sends me pictures of his daughter. Her name is Hope, and he named her that because he said I gave him hope when I saved his life. So when the dark days come, I look at pictures of Hope and I remember why I did what I did, why I survived, why I keep fighting." Steve Harvey listened to all of this, and he was overwhelmed. He had interviewed countless people, heard thousands of stories, but Thomas Mitchell's quiet heroism and ongoing struggle moved him in a way few things ever had. "Thomas, I need to ask you something," Steve said. "Why didn't you want Sarah to tell your story? Why were you so uncomfortable when she started talking about what happened to you?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to answer. "Because I don't feel like a hero, Mr. Harvey. I feel like a man who did his job and paid a price for it. Lots of soldiers have paid bigger prices. Lots of families have lost their loved ones completely. I survived. I'm here with my family. Yes, I'm in pain. Yes, my life is different than it would have been, but I'm alive and they're alive, and that's more than many people get. I don't want special recognition for doing what any squad leader would have done for his men. I don't want people to feel sorry for me or treat me differently. I just want to live my life as normally as possible and try to make the world a little better in whatever small ways I can." Steve shook his head in amazement. "That right there, that's exactly why you deserve recognition. Because you don't want it. Because you don't think what you did was special even though it objectively was. Because you're more concerned about other people than about yourself. That's the mark of a true hero, Thomas. And whether you want the recognition or not, you deserve it, and I'm going to make sure you get it." Over the next hour, Steve and the Family Feud production team worked with the Mitchell family to plan how to proceed. They decided to resume and complete the game, but they also decided to do something unprecedented. They would create a special extended episode that would tell Thomas's story in full, that would honor his service and sacrifice, and that would raise awareness about the ongoing needs of wounded veterans. Steve made some phone calls, pulling in favors and resources. He arranged for Family Feud to make a substantial donation to the VA hospital where Thomas volunteered, specifically to programs serving wounded veterans with PTSD and chronic pain. He contacted James Hendricks, the soldier Thomas had saved, and arranged for him to fly to the taping with his daughter, Hope, to thank Thomas in person. He reached out to advocacy organizations for wounded veterans to create a support fund in Thomas's name that would help other veterans dealing with similar challenges. When taping resumed, the atmosphere in the studio was completely different from any normal Family Feud episode. The audience knew they were witnessing something historic, something important. Steve addressed them directly before continuing the game. We're about to finish this Family Feud game, but I want everyone to understand that what we're really doing here is honoring a hero. Thomas Mitchell served his country with honor, sacrificed his body to save his men, and has lived with the consequences of that sacrifice with more grace and strength than most of us can imagine. His family, especially his daughter Sarah, wanted to make sure his story was told, that his sacrifice was recognized, and we're honored to be part of that. The game resumed, and though everyone went through the motions of playing, the competitive element had evaporated. When the Mitchell family won, which they did handily, the Rodriguez family applauded genuinely, honored to have been part of something meaningful. Before moving to Fast Money, Steve made an announcement. "We have some special guests who wanted to be here today," he said. "Thomas, there are some people who want to thank you." From the side of the stage emerged James Hendricks, the young man Thomas had saved 8 years earlier, carrying his 3-year-old daughter Hope. James was 29 now, healthy and whole, with no visible signs of the injuries he had sustained in that explosion. He walked straight to Thomas, who had frozen in shock at seeing the young soldier he hadn't seen since that day in Afghanistan. "Sir," James said, his voice breaking with emotion, using the formal address soldiers use for superior officers, "I never got to properly thank you for saving my life. The last time I saw you, you were lying on the ground covered in blood, and I thought you were dead. I thought the man who had just saved me had died doing it. When I found out you had survived, I tried to find you, tried to visit you in the hospital, but you were transferred before I could get there. And then I lost track of you in the chaos of my own recovery and coming home." James was crying now, holding his daughter close. "You gave me my life back, sir. You gave me everything. I got to come home, to marry my high school sweetheart, to have this beautiful little girl. Every moment of joy I've experienced in the last 8 years, every good thing that has happened to me, exists because you ran into danger to pull me out of that vehicle. I named my daughter Hope because that's what you gave me. Hope for a future I wouldn't have had without you." Thomas was sobbing, unable to speak, as James handed him the little girl. Hope looked at Thomas with wide, curious eyes and said in a small voice, "Are you the hero my daddy talks about?" Thomas held this child, this living proof that his sacrifice had meaning and value, and he broke down completely. "Yes, sweetheart," he managed to say through his tears, "your daddy is the real hero for being so brave. I just helped a little bit." James shook his head firmly. "No, sir, with all respect, I was screaming and on fire and certain I was going to die. You ran through an active combat zone while under fire to get to me. You put out the flames with your own hands. You dragged me to safety even though you were injured yourself. You saved my life and the lives of 2 other soldiers before the second blast hit you. You are the hero, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to live in a way that honors your sacrifice." The studio audience was on their feet again, crying and applauding. Steve Harvey stood to the side, letting this moment happen, understanding that his role now was just to bear witness to something sacred. Thomas held Hope and looked at James, and something in his face shifted. Some of the guilt and doubt and self-recrimination that had shadowed him for 8 years seemed to lift slightly, replaced by the recognition that yes, his sacrifice had been worth it. Yes, the price he paid had purchased something of profound value. The extended episode that aired 6 weeks later became the most watched Family Feud episode in the show's entire history. The opening segment showed the normal game introduction, but then it transitioned into Sarah's revelation about her father, Steve's emotional reaction, and the full story of Thomas's service and sacrifice. The episode included interviews with Thomas, Rachel, and Sarah about living with the aftermath of war injuries. It showed footage of Thomas volunteering at the VA hospital, working with other wounded veterans who were struggling with the same challenges he faced. It featured James Hendricks and his daughter Hope, their testimonial to Thomas's heroism and the ripple effects of his sacrifice. The episode also included appearances from the two other soldiers Thomas had saved that day, both of whom had flown to the taping to thank him in person. One of them, a man named Marcus Williams, had suffered severe burns but had recovered and was now a firefighter, dedicating his life to saving others just as Thomas had saved him. The other, a woman named Jennifer Costa, had lost her right leg but had gone on to compete in Paralympic track and field, using her experience to inspire other disabled veterans. The response to the episode was overwhelming and immediate. The hashtag #HeroThomas began trending worldwide within hours of the episode airing. Thousands of veterans shared their own stories of service and sacrifice, of living with visible and invisible wounds, of struggling to reintegrate into civilian life after war. Families of wounded veterans reached out to thank Thomas and his family for giving voice to experiences that often went unacknowledged and unappreciated. The VA hospital where Thomas volunteered received an outpouring of donations and volunteer applications. The support fund established in Thomas's name raised over $2 million in the first month alone, money that would go toward helping wounded veterans access the medical care, mental health support, and rehabilitation services they needed. Advocacy organizations for veterans used clips from the episode in their campaigns, helping to raise awareness about the ongoing needs of wounded warriors and the importance of supporting them not just with words, but with resources and action. Political leaders from both parties referenced Thomas's story in speeches about veterans' care and the need for better funding and support systems for those who had sacrificed so much for their country. For Thomas himself, the experience was overwhelming and transformative in ways he hadn't expected. For 8 years, he had carried his suffering privately, trying not to burden others, trying to downplay his pain and his struggles. Having his story told publicly, having his sacrifice acknowledged and honored, gave him permission to accept help, to admit when he was struggling, to allow others to support him the way he had supported his men in combat. I spent so long trying to be strong, trying to handle everything myself, trying not to let anyone see how hard things were, Thomas said in a follow-up interview several months after the episode aired. But when Sarah told my story on that stage, when people responded with so much compassion and support, I realized that accepting help isn't weakness. It's actually another kind of strength. And I needed help. I needed people to understand what I was going through. I needed to stop pretending I was fine when I wasn't. The episode also had a profound impact on Sarah and her family. Sarah had carried the weight of her father's suffering for years, watching him struggle, wanting to help, but not knowing how. Speaking the truth about his sacrifice publicly had been terrifying, but it had also been liberating. I had watched my dad suffer in silence for so long, Sarah explained. I had seen him minimize his pain, downplay his injuries, refuse recognition, and I understood why he did it, because that's who he is, humble and selfless. But I also knew that his story deserved to be told, that people needed to know what soldiers like my dad give up and live with. So when that moment came on Family Feud, when I had the opportunity to finally tell the truth about my dad, I took it, and I'm so glad I did. Rachel spoke about the relief of having their struggles acknowledged after years of silent suffering. People see Thomas walking with a slight limp, and they have no idea what he's been through, what he lives with every day. They don't know about the nights he can't sleep because of pain, about the panic attacks, about the depression and the struggle. For so long, we dealt with all of that privately, not wanting to burden anyone, not wanting people to think of Thomas as damaged or broken. But carrying all of that alone was exhausting. Having it acknowledged, having people understand and offer support, that has helped our whole family heal in ways I didn't even know we needed. 2 years after the Family Feud episode aired, Steve Harvey invited the Mitchell family back for an anniversary special. The transformation in Thomas was visible. He looked healthier, more at peace, less burdened by the weight he had carried for so long. He had written a book about his experiences titled Quiet Heroism, A Soldier's Journey Through War and Recovery, which had become a bestseller and was being used in VA programs across the country to help wounded veterans process their experiences. He had become a sought-after speaker, sharing his story at military events, veterans organizations, and mental health conferences. He had started a nonprofit organization that connected wounded veterans with resources and support, creating the kind of community and assistance network he wished had existed when he was navigating his own recovery. Sarah had gotten married to Daniel in a beautiful ceremony where Thomas had walked her down the aisle without assistance, every painful step worth it to give his daughter the moment she deserved. She had completed her master's degree in social work and was now working specifically with military families, helping them navigate the challenges of deployment, reintegration, and living with war injuries. Rachel had become an advocate for military spouses, speaking about the unique challenges faced by families of wounded veterans and working to create better support systems for caregivers. During the anniversary special, Steve asked Thomas how his life had changed since the original episode aired. Thomas thought carefully before answering, wanting to be honest and complete. In some ways, nothing has changed, he said. I still live with chronic pain. I still have PTSD. I still struggle with some of the same challenges I've struggled with for years. The injuries don't go away just because people know about them now. He paused, then continued. But in other ways, everything has changed. I'm not carrying the burden alone anymore. I have a community of people who understand what I'm going through, other wounded veterans who get it in ways that civilians never can. I have support from people across the country who want to help. I have a purpose in using my experience to help others. And most importantly, I've stopped feeling ashamed of my injuries and my struggles. I've accepted that what I'm dealing with is the result of a choice I made to save my men, and there's no shame in that. There's only honor. Steve asked Sarah if she had any regrets about revealing her father's story so publicly. Sarah shook her head emphatically. Not for 1 second. My dad would never have told his own story because he's too humble, too focused on others. But his story needed to be told. Soldiers like my dad, who sacrificed their bodies and their peace of mind to protect others, and then live with the consequences, without complaint or expectation of recognition, they deserve to be honored. And if I hadn't spoken up that day, if I had given some generic Family Feud answer instead of telling the truth about my dad, I would have regretted it for the rest of my life. The special episode also featured updates from James Hendricks and his daughter Hope, now 5 years old and thriving. James had become close friends with Thomas, the two families getting together regularly, bound by shared experience and profound gratitude. Thomas saved my life, and in doing so, he gave me everything I have now, James said. My wife, my daughter, my career, every good thing in my life exists because of his sacrifice. Hope is growing up knowing that the man who gave her daddy a future is her honorary uncle, and she loves him fiercely. The bond between our families is unbreakable. The episode concluded with Steve making an announcement. Thomas Mitchell came on Family Feud 2 years ago planning to play a game with his family. His daughter Sarah revealed a truth that changed everything, that exposed quiet heroism and ongoing sacrifice that deserved recognition. And what's happened since then has been extraordinary. Lives have been changed, awareness has been raised, support has been given to wounded veterans who needed it desperately. All because one young woman had the courage to speak her truth about her father, and all because one man lived his values of service and sacrifice without seeking recognition or reward. Steve turned to Thomas. You told me 2 years ago that you don't feel like a hero. I want you to know something. The definition of a hero isn't someone who seeks glory or wants recognition. A hero is someone who does what's right even when it costs them everything, who sacrifices for others without expectation of reward, who carries suffering with grace and uses their pain to help others. That's you, Thomas. That is exactly you. And America is better because you served, because you sacrificed, and because you've continued to give even from a place of pain and loss. As we close this powerful story, I want you to think about the heroes in your own life. The people who sacrifice in silence, who carry burdens without complaint, who give of themselves without seeking recognition. Think about the veterans who live with visible and invisible wounds, from service to our country, who need our support not just with words, but with resources and compassion. Thomas Mitchell showed us what quiet heroism looks like, what it means to pay an extraordinary price for doing the right thing, and then to live with that price with dignity and grace. His daughter Sarah showed us the importance of speaking truth about the people we love, of making sure their sacrifices are seen and honored even when they're too humble to seek that honor themselves. If this story has moved you, if it's changed how you think about veterans, about sacrifice, about what it really means to be a hero, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, especially veterans and military families who might need to know they're not alone, that their struggles are seen and their sacrifices are valued. Thomas walked onto a game show stage as a quiet, humble man just trying to support his family, and he walked off as a recognized hero whose story would inspire millions and create real change for wounded veterans across the country. Thank you, Thomas Mitchell, for your service, your sacrifice, and your ongoing commitment to making the world better despite your pain. And thank you, Sarah, for having the courage to tell the truth your father was too humble to tell himself. Your family's story will continue to inspire and heal for generations to come, reminding us all that true heroism often wears the quietest face and carries the heaviest burden without ever asking for recognition or reward.